My son-in-law pointed to the roped-off section of chairs and said, with a smile so polished it could have sold used cars, "We saved you a great spot over here. Ray, the reserved area is just for immediate family. You understand." I looked past him at the front row, where my daughter was sitting, holding my grandson, the baby I had driven 4 hours to see, baptized. I looked back at my son-in-law and I said, "I am immediate family." He patted me on the shoulder the way you pat a dog you don't particularly like. "Of course you are. But the reserved row is just tight, you know? We didn't want it to feel crowded. You'll have a perfect view from right here." Then he walked away to greet someone wearing a watch that cost more than my first house. 3 months later, at 8 o'clock on a Thursday morning, my phone rang. It was my son-in-law. His voice was tight and small, nothing like the man who had guided me to the back row with a smile. "Ray," he said, "we have a situation. The landlord served us a notice. We are behind on the office lease. It is $60,000. I know this is a big ask, but we need a bridge loan. Just until the Series A closes. 2 weeks? Maybe 3. He paused. "You know, I wouldn't ask if I weren't desperate." I sat in my kitchen with my coffee and looked out at the bird feeder I had built from scrap cedar 2 summers ago. I said, "I'll look into it." He thanked me profusely and hung up quickly. The way people do when they are afraid you might change your mind before you even agree to anything. I put the phone down and I smiled, the first real smile I had felt in months. Because here is the thing my son-in-law did not know. He had been paying rent for the last 18 months to a company called Kowalski Commercial Holdings. He had signed the lease, shaken hands with the property manager, and never once asked who actually owned the building. If he had asked, he would have found out the answer was the same man he had just guided to the back row of his son's christening, like an afterthought. "My name is Ray Kowalski. I am 64 years old. I have a scar on my left forearm from a conduit bender that slipped on a job site in 1987. I drive a 10-year-old pickup truck because it runs fine, and I see no reason to change something that works. I wear flannels and work boots because that is what I have always worn, and I am too old and too comfortable to start caring about what strangers think. To look at me, you would think I was exactly what my son-in-law told people I was. A retired electrician who got lucky enough to buy a little house and collect a modest pension. What he told people was almost right. I was a retired electrician. The lucky part, though, was not a house. I had spent 40 years wiring commercial buildings across the Midwest, and somewhere around year 15, I realized I understood the value of those buildings better than the people who owned them. I started buying. Not flashy properties, not downtown towers, strip malls in growing suburbs, warehouse space near logistics corridors, office parks near regional medical centers. I bought things that looked plain and unglamorous because those were the things that were priced right. By the time I retired, Kowalski Commercial Holdings held 12 properties in 4 states and was worth well north of $9 million. I had a property manager who handled the day-to-day. I signed the checks and went fishing. Nobody needed to know more than that. My daughter had been married to my son-in-law for 4 years. When they started dating, I liked him well enough. He was sharp and ambitious, and he made her laugh. I remember being glad she had found somebody confident. The cracks started showing slowly, the way structural damage always does. First, it was small things. He interrupted her at dinner parties to correct her on subjects he knew nothing about. He made jokes at family gatherings that had a way of always landing on someone else's expense. He once told me, at a barbecue the summer before the christening, that electricians were essentially becoming obsolete because of smart home automation. He said this to a man who had wired the building he was standing in. I let it go. I am good at letting things go. I spent 4 decades on job sites where you learn that not every pipe that leaks needs to be replaced on the spot. Sometimes you tape it and you wait. My daughter had our grandson 8 months before the christening. A healthy boy with a grip like a little vice. I drove up to see him. 3 days after he was born. I sat in the hospital chair and held him for 2 hours while my daughter slept and my son-in-law took meetings on his phone in the hallway. When I left, I kissed my daughter on the forehead, and I told her she had done something extraordinary. She squeezed my hand and said, "We couldn't have done any of this without you, Dad." My son-in-law came back in as I was leaving, and he shook my hand and said the baby looked just like him, which he did not. But I said, "He sure does." And I drove home. The christening was at a church in the suburbs. White steeple. Carved wooden pews. The kind of place that charges you for parking and calls it a donation. I arrived 20 minutes early. Because I am always early. I wore my good blazer, the dark navy one I bought for my wife's funeral 6 years ago and have worn to every significant occasion since. I had a card in my breast pocket with a check for $500 inside, because that felt like the right amount for a grandfather to give his grandson on a day like this. The front pews were already roped off with white satin ribbon. I saw my son-in-law near the altar, talking to a group of men in expensive suits, laughing the kind of laugh that is performed rather than felt. When he saw me, he came over. And that is when he pointed to the back rows and explained that the reserved section was for immediate family only. I took my seat, 3 rows from the back. From where I sat, I could see the curve of my grandson's head when my daughter held him. I could not see his face during the baptism. My son-in-law's college friends sat 2 rows in front of me. I had never met them in my life. After the ceremony, there was a reception at their house. I put my check in the card box, and I ate a piece of cake that tasted like cardboard. I spoke to my daughter for 12 minutes, because the rest of the time, she was being circulated by my son-in-law to people he wanted to impress. I left before the toasts. I told myself it was because I had a long drive. The truth was, I did not want to sit in a room and watch a man brag about himself while standing in a life I had quietly helped finance. 2 weeks after the christening, I was having coffee with my property manager, a capable woman named Diane who had run my portfolio for 11 years. We were reviewing the quarterly collections report when she mentioned that the tenant in Suite 4B of the Westbrook Office Park was running behind again. They were late in Q2 also, she said, pushing the file across the table. Want me to send the standard notice? I looked at the file. The tenant name was Delta Crest Ventures LLC. The primary contact was listed as my son-in-law's full legal name. I set my coffee down. I picked up the file and read through it carefully. He had signed the lease personally. He had listed a personal cell phone number. He had paid the deposit with a check from a joint account that I was quite certain was partially funded by money I had given my daughter as a birthday gift 18 months earlier. I looked at the address of the office suite. It was a clean, modern space in a building I had owned for 7 years. The lobby had a waterfall feature. It had a prestigious zip code. It was exactly the kind of address a startup founder would use to impress investors and make himself look larger than he was. It was the kind of address my son-in-law had almost certainly mentioned in every pitch deck he had ever circulated. And he had no idea the man who owned the tile under his feet was the same man he had pointed to the back row at his son's baptism. I handed the file back to Diane. "Send the standard notice," I said. "But do not use my name on anything. All communications go through the management company only. I want to handle this one myself." Diane looked at me for a moment. She had worked with me long enough to know when I was simply managing a delinquent tenant and when something else was in motion. She nodded and said nothing more. I did not hear from my son-in-law for another 6 weeks. In that time, based on Diane's reports, he made 1 partial payment, missed the following month entirely, and sent 2 emails to the management office saying the delay was temporary and that a significant investor commitment was imminent. I knew the language of people who are running out of road. I had heard it from commercial tenants before. The word imminent in a payment excuse letter means the money does not exist yet and may never arrive. I instructed Diane to issue a formal notice of delinquency and begin the documentation process for potential eviction. I told her to keep the tone professional and cold, exactly the way you treat a stranger who has stopped paying. My daughter called me 2 days after the notice was issued. Her voice was strained, the way it gets when she is trying to be calm about something that is making her anything but calm. "Dad, did you know you own the building where my husband has his office?" I let a moment pass before I answered. I own a lot of buildings, I said. What's the address? She told me and I said, yes, I believe that one is mine. The silence that followed was the loudest I had heard from her since her mother died. He got a notice, she said finally, from the management company. Well, he thinks it is just some corporate landlord who doesn't care, but I saw the paperwork and the address matched one of your properties on that list you gave me when you updated your will. I had given her a simple asset overview 2 years ago in case anything happened to me. I had never expected it to surface quite like this. He owes $60,000, Dad. Then he should pay it, I said. But Dad. Sweetheart, I said, and I kept my voice gentle, because I love my daughter, and none of this was her fault. He is a tenant. The lease has terms. The terms aren't being met. That's a business matter. She went quiet again. Then she said, is this about the christening? I told her I would see her soon, and that I loved her very much, and I hung up. The call from my son-in-law came 3 days later. I had described already how it went. The tight voice, the $60,000 ask, the 2-week promise. What I did not mention yet is what happened in the background while I was sitting with my coffee. Because as he was talking, I could hear another voice behind him. A woman. Sharp and impatient. I recognized her cadence from the handful of times she had spoken to me directly at family events, which was not many. It was his mother. And she was saying, loud enough to carry through the phone, just tell him, it is a family emergency. He will fold. He always does. He is desperate for your approval. Use it. My son-in-law moved slightly away from the phone, but not far enough. I heard him say in a low voice, he is already agreeing. It is fine. He came back on the line and said, Ray, you are a lifesaver. I mean that. I will pay you back, double. I said I would look into it, and ended the call. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. The birds were at the feeder. A female cardinal had figured out how to knock the sunflower seeds to the ground, and a pair of mourning doves were cleaning up underneath her. I thought about my wife, who used to say that the most dangerous thing you can do for someone you love is make their problems disappear before they understand how they got there. She said that to me about my daughter once, during a rough patch, when my daughter was in her 20s and I kept smoothing things over. My wife was usually right about those things. I called Diane. I told her to accelerate the documentation timeline. I told her I wanted a formal eviction filing prepared but not filed yet. I also told her to schedule a property walkthrough for the following Tuesday at 9 in the morning, and to send notice to the tenant that the building owner would be conducting a routine inspection. Standard language. Tenant must provide access. I asked her to please not mention my name. On Monday evening, my son-in-law sent me a text. It said, Ray, the investor meeting is Tuesday at 10 a.m. at the office. Big day for us. If you can get me that bridge confirmation before then, it would mean everything. These are serious people, and I want to go in strong. He added a handshake emoji. I did not respond. Tuesday morning, I arrived at Westbrook Office Park at 8:50. I was driving my old truck, but I was not wearing my flannel shirt. I was wearing a charcoal jacket over a clean white shirt, nothing tailored or dramatic, just neat and deliberate. Diane met me in the lobby. She handed me the full tenant file. We walked up to the second floor together. Suite 4B had a glass door with Delta Crest Ventures printed on it, in clean sans serif lettering. Through the glass, I could see my son-in-law standing at the head of a conference table. There were 4 other people seated around the table, men and women in business casual, notebooks open, the body language of people who are evaluating something. An investor meeting. Right on schedule. My son-in-law was mid-sentence when he noticed movement outside the glass. He glanced toward the door. Our eyes met. I watched the color leave his face, the way water drains from a bathtub. He excused himself and came out to the hallway. He looked at me, then at Diane, then at the folder under my arm. Ray, he said, and his voice had lost all of its polish. What are you doing here? I have a meeting. This is not a good time. I know you have a meeting, I said. I scheduled the walkthrough for 9. He blinked. The walkthrough. Of my property, I said. Suite 4B, which you currently owe $60,000 in back rent on. The door behind him opened and one of the investors, a heavy-set man with a kind face, leaned out. Brandon, everything all right? My son-in-law held up a hand. 1 minute, just a landlord issue. The investor looked at me with the calm, reading look of a man who has evaluated hundreds of situations quickly and accurately. He stayed in the doorway. I looked at my son-in-law. He was trying to calculate something behind his eyes, running scenarios, looking for the lever that would make me step back and let him save the meeting. Ray, he said, dropping his voice. Please, these people flew in this morning. I am 48 hours from closing a deal that changes everything for me, for your daughter, for your grandson. If you walk in there right now, you will blow it up. Is that what you want? I thought about the white satin ribbon across the front pew. I thought about my daughter holding my grandson while I watched from the back row. I thought about my son-in-law's mother saying, "He always folds." I straightened the folder in my hand. I'm not here to blow anything up, I said. I'm here to inspect my property. Whether that is convenient for you is not something my lease agreement requires me to consider. I walked past him. Diane held the door open. I stepped into the conference room. The 4 investors looked up. I introduced myself simply. I said my name, and I said I was the owner of the building. The heavy-set man who had been in the doorway extended a hand and said his name was Gerald Hartley, and that he was the managing partner of a regional investment group based in Columbus. He said, "You own this building?" I said I did, along with 11 others. One of the other investors, a woman in her 40s, asked which portfolio that was under. When I told her the company name, she sat forward slightly. She said, "Kowalski Commercial? You developed the Meridian Park complex in Indianapolis in 2009? That was a project I had put together during the recession when everybody else was running and the prices were extraordinary." I said, "Yes, that was me." Gerald Hartley looked at my son-in-law, then back at me. Brandon told us his major investor was a silent partner, a private real estate developer. He said it carefully, not accusingly, just placing the pieces on the table to see what picture they made. My son-in-law was standing near the door. He looked like a man watching a building collapse from the inside. I did not say anything that was not true. I said only what needed to be said. I said that the tenant in this suite had a current outstanding balance of $60,000. I said that this was not a bridge loan situation or a family matter. I said it was a business matter, and the documentation was being prepared. Gerald Hartley listened, with his hands folded. When I was finished, he said, "Thank you, Mr. Kowalski." Then he looked at my son-in-law and said, "Brandon, I think we need to pause and regroup." He began closing his notebook. My son-in-law stepped forward. His voice cracked. "Gerald, this is a misunderstanding. Ray and I have a complicated family situation. He's my father-in-law. This is personal. He's not actually going to evict me. He's just making a point." Gerald Hartley looked at me. I said nothing. The absence of any reassurance from me was louder than anything I could have spoken. Gerald stood, and the other investors followed. One of the women offered me a business card as she passed, which I thought was a thoughtful and slightly remarkable thing to do given the circumstances. They filed out. The glass door swung shut behind them with a soft click that echoed in the empty room. My son-in-law stood at the head of the conference table. His pitch deck was still pulled up on a wall-mounted screen. I could see the slide he had been on when I walked in. A. It said, in large, clean letters, "Building on a foundation of independence." I looked at that slide for a moment. "You told people I was a silent investor," I said. It was not a question. I told them I had access to private capital. I didn't specify who. You used my building's address to establish credibility with those people. He was quiet. "You told your mother I would fold because I'm desperate for your approval." His head came up at that. "You heard that. You didn't move far enough from the phone," I said. I set the folder on the conference table. I opened it to the formal eviction notice that Diane had prepared. I turned it to face him, and I slid it across the table. The filing goes to the county clerk on Friday, unless the full balance is received before then. That's $60,420, including late fees. He stared at the paper. His hands were shaking. He said, "I don't have it." I said, "I know." He said, "What am I supposed to do?" I said, "Figure it out. That is what self-made men do." He looked up at me, and something changed in his face. The performance fell away. The sheen of the entrepreneur, the polished son-in-law, the man who knew which fork to use and where to seat the grandfather at the christening, all of it dissolved, and what was underneath was younger and more frightened than I had expected. He said, "I don't know how to do this, Ray." It was the quietest thing he had said to me in 4 years. I believed it. I believed it. I believed it. That was the part that almost broke me. Not the cruelty, not the scheming, but the smallness of the man underneath all of it. I pulled out the chair across from him and I sat down. He stayed standing. I said, "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to actually listen." He nodded. I said, "I was an apprentice electrician at 19 years old. I made $4.80 an hour. I worked under a man named Pete Grabowski, who smelled like motor oil, and made me rewire the same junction box 12 times before he said. I had it right. I hated him for 6 months. Then I realized he was the only person in my life who was teaching me something real. I looked at my son-in-law. You have spent 4 years making sure I knew you thought I was beneath you. You seated me in the back row at my own grandson's baptism because you were embarrassed by my jacket. And the whole time, you were building your business in my building, using my address to look successful, and planning to use my money to stay afloat when the wheels came off." He said nothing. I continued, "I'm not going to bail you out. I'm not going to fold, but I am also not filing that eviction on Friday." He looked up. "I'm giving you 60 days, I said. 60 days to either pay what you owe or vacate the premises professionally. No sheriff, no furniture on the curb, no public record if you handle it with integrity. In exchange, I want one thing." He waited. "I want you to go home tonight and tell my daughter the truth. All of it. Not a version of it. The balance, the investors, the call to your mother, the part where you told her I'd fold. All of it." He flinched. "She'll leave me," he said. I said, "That is her choice to make, and she can only make it with honest information. That's all I'm asking. 60 days and the truth." He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Okay." I stood up. I picked up the folder. 60 days starts today," I said. I walked out of the conference room and down the hallway, and through the lobby and out into the parking lot. I sat in my truck for a few minutes before starting the engine. The morning sun was hitting the glass facade of the office park and throwing squares of light across the asphalt. I thought about my wife again. I thought about the cardinal at the bird feeder. I thought about my grandson in my daughter's arms. His face turned away from me during the baptism because I was too far back to see it. My daughter called me that night at 9:30. She had been crying. She told me he had told her everything. She said she was angry and she was not sure yet what she was going to do, and she needed time. I said that was exactly the right response, and that I was not going anywhere, and that whatever she decided I would support. She said, "Why didn't you just tell me, Dad?" I said, "Because it wasn't mine to tell. Some things a person has to say themselves, and some things a person has to hear from the right voice. I wasn't the right voice." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You could have called Gerald Hartley 6 months ago and warned him. You could have done this long before the christening." I said, "Yes, I could have." She said, "Why didn't you?" I said, "Because I needed to know who he was when there was real pressure. People tell you who they are when there is something to lose. I just needed him to feel what it cost." My son-in-law vacated the suite 41 days later. He moved his operation to a shared workspace in a less prestigious part of town. He got a part-time consulting contract at a marketing firm to cover his overhead. It wasn't the Series A. It wasn't the pitch deck vision. But it was real money he had earned himself for the first time in a long time. And I suspect it felt different than he expected. He called me 6 weeks after the move and said, "I owe you more than the rent." I said, "Yeah, but the rent would be a start." He didn't laugh, but he didn't hang up either. We talked for 11 minutes. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. I don't know what comes next for him and my daughter. That is their story to write, not mine. I signed the new lease for Suite 4B 3 weeks later. A woman who runs an occupational therapy practice for children. She paid her first month plus the deposit on the same day, ahead of the deadline. Diane sent me the confirmation, and I put it in the file and went back to the bird feeder. I have thought about what I want to say if anyone asks me what I learned from all of this. And I think it comes down to one thing. The most expensive thing I ever gave my son-in-law was not the building or the address or the latitude I extended month after month while he worked out what kind of man he wanted to be. The most expensive thing I gave him was the silence, the years of letting things pass because the price of confronting them felt too high. Real respect, the kind that means something, does not come from keeping the peace. It comes from telling the truth at the right moment and being willing to let the chips fall where they are supposed to fall. I should have done that sooner. That part is on me. But better late than never, as my wife used to say. And she was usually right. If this story hit you somewhere familiar, if you have ever been underestimated by the people you gave the most to, leave a like so more people can find this. Subscribe to Revenge Diaries for more stories about reclaiming your dignity when the people who should know better forget who you are. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to let someone fail before they could finally hear you? I would really like to know.